Join us on an investigative journey as we educate each other on a scientific discovery, concept, or phenomenon.
Then we'll take a dive into the complicated and misleading world of pseudoscience to sort the factual from the fabricated.
I'm Matt McCabe.
And I'm Levi Bateman.
And this is Idio Facto.
Now, I don't know if you can hear this in my voice, in my overly nasally tones, but I'm actually a little bit ill at the moment.
Oh, maybe you caught it from me.
Well, I most certainly didn't.
Well, considering we haven't been in the same place for about the last, 6 months at least?
God, has it been that? Yeah, probably. Maybe even longer, actually. I think the last time I saw you was our road trip before Season 2 started.
Yeah. Well, maybe we caught it over the internet.
Maybe. Like a virus?
I hear that electromagnetic frequencies can be pretty damaging to your health, apparently.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, from somebody.
Right. Doesn't sound overly credible.
Sounds like I need a dose of Idio Facto, though.
It kind of does. But anyway, this is basically my apology in advance if I have to take a little cough break or if I'm a little bit sniffly because I'm ill.
No. Well, at least you don't sound like you're talking from underwater like you did in the first half of last week.
Oh, what a bloody mess up that was.
It's okay. Yes, if we ever needed a reminder that we are very much amateurs recording in our bedrooms, there you go.
Yeah, sometimes we have technical issues.
I mean, it's kind of amazing that we've gone this long without having serious issues like that. So
it is. I mean, I also wouldn't call it a serious issue. We still got the audio.
It was a serious issue.
Yeah, this guy, right?
You didn't have to edit it.
Oh, okay. That's a good point. Well, I've done all the tests this week, and as far as I know, I'm recording on the condenser mic.
Well, we'll find out when I get to editing, won't we?
Well, I hope so.
At this stage, I'm just trusting in you, which has led to my downfall in the past. So.
Well, you can always hire me a studio.
Yeah, that's great. I'd love to do that for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll just have to put up with our bedroom recording setups.
Well, it's worked up until this point, so, we talk a lot about science on this show.
Do we? When?
Yeah, we do. Well, I mean, occasionally we talk about science. And we talk a lot about the scientific method and flaws in studies and logical fallacies. So much so that I thought it was about time we addressed the reason that we and humanity trust so much in science and why the scientific method is the best way we have yet developed as humans to objectively assess the universe that we live in.
Right.
So like last week, for example, talking about the Sumerians and timekeeping, I said it would be interesting to think about how far technology would have come by now if they'd had the knowledge that we have today. And the reason that they didn't was in no small part because they lacked a formalised way of conducting empirical investigations. And that's what the scientific method is.
Exactly. I was once in a discussion verging on an argument with somebody actually about tarot cards. And this was years before we started the podcast and years before I did the episode on tarot. But their point was they were pro tarot card, and I was obviously pointing out some of the reasons why I maybe shouldn't trust tarot cards. And they said to me, what makes you think that scientists are any more qualified to talk about horoscopes and tarot than the layperson, than anybody else? What makes you trust science and not alternative medicine or something like that? And I knew in my head exactly the reasons why, but I kind of couldn't verbalize it. I couldn't articulate it in a way that would make them understand. So,
well, allow me to articulate the reasons why we trust in science.
Excellent.
So the scientific method in a primitive form from the one that we know today was developed and formalized in the Renaissance, where early scientists like Galileo and Copernicus began to talk about falsification and develop formal testable hypotheses before then going on to test those hypotheses to confirm what were basically hunches. So Galileo died in 1642, and in that same year, Isaac Newton was born. And Newton's widely considered to be the first modern scientist and basically sparked a revolution in logical thinking that continues to this day.
Do you believe in reincarnation?
Of course not.
Okay.
Why?
Well, I'm sure that some people may see the death of Galileo and the birth of Isaac Newton in the same year as Maybe just a crazy coincidence, or maybe there's something else going on.
Yeah. Well, my rational, skeptical mind would suggest that it was a coincidence.
Okay.
But yeah, you're right. I can't, talking about falsification, I definitely can't prove that it wasn't Galileo reincarnated, but...
Exactly. But go on with your science talk, you heathen.
So before Galileo and Newton, investigations were more ad hoc and unstructured and often suppressed by various religious organisations and governing bodies because, well, basically they threatened the status quo. This doesn't mean that we as a species didn't know anything, it just meant that progress was often slow and underfunded. However, structuring science has meant that for about the last 300 years, we've been investigating our world in a much more intellectually rigorous way than ever before in human history. And thus, we see the relatively sudden boom in technology and innovation that we have today. So, let's get into it. The scientific method consists of 5 major steps with an important 6th step that kind of renews the cycle of scientific investigation. So the 5 steps are observation, question, hypothesis, prediction, testing, and iteration being the 6th renewal step. So the best way of illustrating each part of this process is to develop a very basic example. So I've taken one from an excellent article by the Khan Academy, and I'll put a link in the show notes for this. And if you haven't heard of the Khan Academy, I definitely recommend checking them out because it's aimed at high school students, but it's a really good way of getting back to the basics of scientific concepts. And I used it throughout uni and I continue to use it today. I used it as research for this podcast today. So
sounds like a good resource.
It's an excellent resource. And I encourage you to go and have a look in the show notes for the link and have a look at all of the other videos on the Khan Academy. It's an excellent resource. So, back to the scientific method. The first 2 steps are relatively straightforward, observation and question. To begin with, you make an observation about the world. So in this example, say you observe that your toaster is not toasting your bread. You put the bread in the toaster, you wait for a while, nothing seems to happen. Then the next step is you ask a question that's based on the observation. So, for example, why doesn't my bread get toasted? That's just a very simple question that's based on your observation. So that's the first 2 steps. And then from this question, you propose a testable hypothesis. We talk a lot on this show about falsification. So an unfalsifiable claim is useless for scientific purposes. A scientific hypothesis must be both testable and falsifiable. So subsequently, the hypothesis, my bread doesn't toast because an undetectable, invisible fairy uses magic to untoast it every time it starts to toast, it's patently ridiculous, right? But sometimes something much more subtle can also be unfalsifiable. For example, the bread won't toast because sometimes bread just doesn't want to be toasted, right? It's just as unfalsifiable and just as useless, but slightly less ridiculous. Only slightly less ridiculous. Any question that cannot be disproved is a bad hypothesis.
I mean, there must have been a time, though, sorry to interrupt, but there must have been a time when that wasn't a silly hypothesis, though, right?
Testable
hypothesis. Like someone at one stage would have gone, well, maybe it is some sneaky little fairies, and they didn't.
Yeah, that would have been fairly early on, you would imagine, because but also it's an unfalsifiable hypothesis. So, once you have a formalized scientific method, that question is basically never asked because that hypothesis is never tested because it can't be tested. So it's never really been seriously considered at least since the formalized scientific method has been introduced. It won't have been tested by mainstream science because it can't be. And it has never been a working theory because it's
good point.
Unable to be tested. So people may have thought that at some stage, but it's never been seriously considered as I guess the closest thing that we'd get to that that's dangerous to say. The closest thing we would get to that is religion.
God.
Yeah.
Oh no, the 2 things we said we weren't going to talk about.
Oh, I know.
Religion and politics. We've kind of brushed past both of them a few times. Actually, we get really political all the time, but
we do.
I'm going to talk a little bit about God too this week. Oh my goodness me.
Okay, well, it's one that we won't go into very much, but the God hypothesis is an unfalsifiable claim. We'll leave it at that.
Cool.
No, we'll leave it at that.
It's a slippery slope.
It is. I know.
Don't start.
Okay. Any question that cannot be disproved is a bad hypothesis, at least for scientific purposes. So in this case, let us imagine that the hypothesis is this particular power outlet is not working and therefore my bread does not get toasted. A hypothesis is scientifically distinct from a theory. So a lot of intelligent design proponents argue that the theory of evolution is just a theory and therefore is not a proven fact. But in science, a theory is a hypothesis that has been so widely and thoroughly tested and held up to scrutiny that it's basically considered fact.
You're right. The word theory and the definition behind it get gravely misused by people that don't understand scientific method, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the difference between a hypothesis and a theory is they're miles apart. A theory becomes a theory once it's been subject to decades of scientific analysis and still can't be disproved. So it's not to say that it's not subject to change or modification in the face of contradictory evidence. In fact, that is the entire point of science, is that it is subject to change based on new and compelling evidence.
It's just our best available answer at the time, and good luck proving it wrong, and we welcome you if you'd like to try and prove it wrong, but, it hasn't been so far.
Exactly. And what we are saying is that contradictory evidence has not actually ever been found yet. So until it is, we will call it a theory and therefore consider it as basically fact.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the theory of gravity, the theory of evolution, the theory of relativity, all of those things have been held up to scrutiny and not been able to be disproved. Therefore, almost, for practical purposes, indistinct from fact. So technically, a hypothesis can never be proved to be correct. It can only be proved wrong.
Ah.
And even then, it's practically impossible to absolutely prove one way or the other, given the limitations of our universe and our human minds.
How can that... So a hypothesis cannot be proved right.
Correct.
So what if your hypothesis is this power outlet is faulty in the toast scenario?
Well, it can't be proved right, absolutely.
Well, you can plug other appliances into it, and if they work in different power outlets but don't work in this one, can you not assume that it's that power outlet?
Maybe a combination of that power outlet and the toaster. You can't absolutely say that it might have just been a coincidence that toaster didn't work with that power outlet. You can't absolutely definitely say that the power outlet is definitely the only problem.
I think with the right tools, though, you probably can. Like if I got a multimeter and found that there's no voltage coming out of this power outlet.
I mean, that's the thing, though. We can come as close as possible to saying that it's a fact, but there's always going to be some level of doubt. You can't definitively prove it. There's always going to be a potentially a confounding variable, or it's like climate change. All of the evidence points to it being a fact, but because we can't definitively say absolutely yes, anthropogenic climate change is a fact, that leaves some room for people to think that it is not the best working theory. Do you know what I mean?
Not entirely. Because I think there's certain hypotheses that we can, without violating Occam's razor, pretty well say that if I used a multimeter and tested that power outlet and found there to be no voltage coming out, how could that hypothesis not hold up as true?
Well, because your multimeter might be faulty.
But if we tested the...
Yeah, but something about that connection, maybe it might just be a coincidence that your multimeter only fails when it's near that power outlet.
I see what you're saying.
There's always, however unlikely the exception, and however much it violates Occam's razor, there's always potentially an exception.
Okay.
You can never absolutely definitively say this is definitely the case. Practically, all we can do is try to prove it wrong and come to something that resembles the correct answer.
Which is why we develop theories.
That's right.
Like a theory, as you're saying, technically there's no way that we can absolutely say that it's true, but given all the testing and the evidence, we can fairly well trust it.
Yeah. And it's predictive as well. So like a theory is predictive. It predicts that in certain situations this will happen, and if that thing happens in those situations, then it shows that your theory is more likely to be the correct one.
Okay.
But hey, guess what?
What?
The concept of falsifiability is going to have to be one all on its own. because it's a huge topic, because of course it is, because this is ideo facto.
What? It's more complicated than it first seems.
I know, who would have thought?
Oh.
So I think I'm going to do an episode in the future on falsifiability and a few of the more intricate parts of the scientific method. But for our purposes, suffice to say, a hypothesis has to be testable and falsifiable and technically can never be proved to be correct.
Hey, just while we're on sort of little ideo facto sidebars that deserve their own episode, I was listening to an episode the other day and we made mention to something and I think it was you or I said, oh, but we might have to do a whole nother episode on that. I was actually thinking that maybe I should go back through every episode and every time we say that, add that topic, add that particular topic to the science or the pseudoscience list.
Yes.
And I think you may have started to do it, but it's a really good idea because that'll just about double the number on our current list because we seem to almost
Which
say
is
it every
already
episode.
Ridiculous. But yeah, we do seem to say that every episode. Back to the scientific method. After you make a hypothesis, you then make a prediction based on that hypothesis. This is an essential part of the method that needs to happen before the testing phase. Many scientific studies have been ruined by retroactively assigning hypotheses and predictions. If you adapt your prediction to suit the results, you may be finding patterns where there aren't necessarily patterns. It's a phenomenon known as post hoc theorizing, which I won't go into today, probably need its own ideo facto by itself.
Yeah.
But it's a form of the circular reasoning logical fallacy. You get results, therefore you make a reason why you get those results, and you use those results as the evidence of that reason. And it's just circular reasoning. We'll go into it further another day, but you must make a hypothesis and a prediction before you test.
Is this another reason why, kind of related, why blinding is so important?
Yes, partly.
So that you don't look for trends that, you've already made up your mind on?
Yeah, and, that's why you double blind studies.
Yes.
But I think I'm in fact, right now, I'm going to go on to our drive and put double blind, placebo-controlled research.
Might even be an idiofactoid.
Pretty big topic.
Yeah, that's true.
Anyway, cool. So we've just added 3 things to our list of science topics. Excellent.
Awesome.
So it's essential that you make a prediction and a hypothesis before you carry out testing. So then you develop a test to try and disprove your hypothesis. Basically, you say, what would make this not the case? So in this case, it would be the test will make the test plug the toaster into a different wall outlet and see if it works. So if we try a different outlet and it toasts, then we can accept our hypothesis. If a different outlet doesn't work, we must reject our hypothesis.
That makes sense.
It's essential at the testing phase to keep all of the variables consistent, except the one that we're measuring. So this is nearly impossible in most cases, but it's important to control as many variables as is possible. So for example, if we use a different toaster in a different outlet, then we won't know whether it's the toaster or the outlet that's the problem. And while that's fairly obvious in this context, confounding variables can be much more subtle. For example, we could try the same toaster in another outlet but with a different power lead, or the same toaster with a different type of bread that might require less heat to toast or something like that. So it's really essential that you control all of the variables. In the case of the toaster, say that we do control our variables and the toaster does toast in a different outlet. Then we can accept our hypothesis. And this part's important. This does not necessarily mean that it is definitely true. It means that in this particular test, we couldn't reject the hypothesis, so we accept the hypothesis. There are other explanations why it could have worked in another outlet and not in the original outlet. Some of these we can rule out by testing the original outlet several times. Some of them we couldn't rule out without a new study altogether. But we present our results, we write a conclusion, and then we discuss what issues there might have been with our experiment and what could constitute confounding variables, and we suggest a direction for the future research. So for example, we might say, we tested the toaster in a different outlet and it worked, therefore we accept our hypothesis that the outlet was at fault. However, the lead for the toaster may also be faulty, and this could contribute to the original outlet not working, future research should focus on other appliances in the original outlet or trying different toaster leads in various outlets and things like that. So we're writing the conclusion for our study and suggesting the future direction for research.
Okay.
So that's the final important step, iteration. Science is an iterative process. Based on the evidence of the toaster problem, we can't necessarily say that the original power outlet was the only problem. Maybe a different toaster would work in it. Maybe it wasn't plugged in properly. Is it the physical outlet connection or an electrical problem in the walls? All of these questions can be tested in further iterations of this experiment with their own hypotheses and predictions. Assuming the original method was recorded accurately, other people would be able to repeat the experiment and get consistent results. But no single study can definitively answer a single question. It takes an entire body of iterative evidence. Iterative evidence is a hard phrase to say.
Iterative evidence.
Okay, well, you can say it, whatever.
That happens all the time, actually, where you really, really struggle to say a really simple phrase like iterative evidence, and I just nail it. Straight away, boom.
Anyway, it takes an entire body of iterative evidence to do this. There you go, I said it.
Got it.
Science is a process of decades and progresses in small steps. Rarely is there a large breakthrough which completely changes well-established theories. The scientific method is far from perfect, but in theory, it should completely remove subjectivity from our assessment of the world. And when done well, it allows us to step back to logically and objectively evaluate our place in the world and the way it works. It's an elegant solution to human emotional subjectivity, though it's not completely immune from it. It's important to remember that scientists are humans with emotions and irrational thoughts, though as scientists, we strive to always judge our work dispassionately and critically.
This afternoon, I ate a mango.
Oh, yes.
And it was the first mango of the season. First mango of the
Mangoes
the summer.
are the best.
They're pretty good, but there's just one thing about them that I'm not really so into. And it's how much of the fruit gets taken up by the seed.
Yes.
And the unwillingness of the flesh to separate from the seed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like with a nectarine,
Absolutely.
You can cut it or you can bite into it. And the seed kind of just like peels away from the flesh.
Yes. Relinquishes its control over the flesh.
Okay. Well, I guess. No, it does. But I kind of thought, because, mango flesh, the fruit flesh is just so delicious. It's one of the best fruits in terms of flavour.
Yep. Concur with that.
I thought, how amazing would it be if you could peel a mango like a banana? Or like peel a banana and the banana flesh. I do love bananas, but the banana flesh was mango. You know what I mean? Imagine that. Imagine if we could modify the mango so that we could peel it like a banana and there was no seed in the middle.
I mean, that would be cool, but it would be very strange.
It would be, but we could do it with a heap of fruit. Imagine a pineapple. Imagine a pineapple that had the skin of like a mandarin and you could just peel the skin off and then inside was just this pineapple flesh. Oh,
none of the fruits that we recognise today look anything like their natural. When I say natural, I mean naturally occurring types.
I know that. You know how I know? It's because I've spent the last day or so researching genetically modified organisms.
Right.
Or GMOs. And thank you for the carefully crafted segue there.
Yes. Well, you got me there eventually.
Yeah.
You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink.
You can lead a Matt to a topic, but you can't make him produce a useful segue. Without the utmost prompting. Well, anyway, that aside, the research gods have been most kind to me this week. And of course, I'm speaking figuratively as I'm unsurprisingly an atheist. But the internet is actually full of info.
We're breaking all of our rules.
Bugger it. It's our show. We can do what we want.
Season 2 is the season of rule breaking. What rebels we are.
You know what? We can even say and all that kind of... You'll bleep these, won't you?
I will, yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Because we can do whatever we want, but we're not heathens, Levi. Well, we are heathens, but we're not.
I don't know. Speak for yourself. I'm pretty crazy.
Cool. crazy enough to record a science podcast every Sunday. What a
suppose.
crazy man.
Yeah, that's loose. Where was I? Yeah, so the internet is full of really good info on GMOs from both sides, and it's probably the pseudoscience topic I've covered that has the most articles and videos discussing the truth rather than the hysteria.
Really?
Which was really good to see. Yeah, it was great. But genetically modified organisms, of course, isn't a pseudoscience. So just as these nasty scientists have done to the unconsenting organisms to create frankenfoods, let me break apart the topic of GMOs and insert some knowledge and facts into your head.
Wow.
You like that?
Yeah. I don't like it, no. But
Oh, I don't love that? Oh,
no.
that was
I
alright.
appreciate the work that went into forming such an awful...
Oh, a lot of work, let me tell you.
Yeah. You must have thought about it for literally seconds.
I did. So usually I watch a lot of videos for my research. I'm a really visual learner. And also there's just some really excellent explanatory videos made by some really smart people.
It's so funny when I see our show notes come out because we do our show notes separately and then combine them at the end. And Levi's show notes always have, this is this video, and mine's always like article. And if anything illustrates the difference in the way that we learn, it's the fact that our show notes are always very different.
I often back it up, but I think usually I pick videos that still give citations, so it's like a citationception. But
yes.
Yeah, it's a very good point. We are different learners. Who would have thought, eh? Yeah, as I was saying, there's some excellent explanatory videos made by some really smart people, and actually, I wouldn't be entirely closed off to going to a video-based podcast, but, well, we could probably talk about that off air. But in doing research for this show, I came across some great videos that explain the topic, and I found a cool video with deGrasse Tyson talking about GMOs with the GMO scientist. There's a good Kurzgesagt documentary on GMOs, and I think we've actually used Kurzgesagt for a few of our topics. They're another YouTube channel that are
videos.
Really great, really informative. There's a good SciShow mini doco on GMOs. My point is that there's a lot of good information. So I'll take you through what GMOs are to start with, before I get into all the other, juicy stuff that we're really here for. So firstly, just a really quick lesson on evolution, natural selection, genetic inheritance, etc. And I need to cover this, but I'm going to be very basic. And at some points, I might call upon the biologist to help me out because I didn't look any of this up. This just comes from my early uni biology knowledge and year 12 cell biology.
Sure, I'll see what I can do.
So essentially, all living things are made up of cells. How am I going so far?
Oh, phew. Yeah. You're okay. Just be careful where you go here.
Inside all of these cells are these things called organelles, which are just tiny little organs, and they've all got different jobs. And one of these organelles is the nucleus. So inside the nucleus is this stuff called DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, which at the end of the day is just a chemical. DNA is just a chemical. So it's basically a double helix structure, which looks kind of like a twisted ladder. And it's a code, or a set of instructions, for the cell's, let's call it the protein factory. It's actually got an even cooler name than that. It's called the endoplasmic reticulum. So the DNA gives instructions on which proteins to code for by using genes. So a gene is just any certain number of base pairs or links on the twisted ladder formation of the DNA. Now, I'm aware that there's a few more steps than this, but essentially, a gene from the DNA goes into the endoplasmic reticulum, or the protein factory, as an instruction on which protein to make, and the endoplasmic reticulum makes a protein and spits it out. As I said, I know that there's a few more steps, but that's very basic. And there's billions of these genes within each organism's DNA. So the physical features in an organism that they express is called the phenotype. For example, a phenotype in a certain, so far unnamed, four-legged African antelope-type creature might be neck length. So certain genes will code for proteins that result in a slightly longer neck. So these slightly different genes come from mutations, and we always think of a mutation as being a really bad thing. And yeah, sometimes it can be. DNA mutations can be bad, but it's not always bad, and often it's very helpful for surviving. Mutations can create some really great traits.
Well, they don't have a goal in mind. Like, mutations happen. Sometimes they're advantageous, sometimes they're not, but there's no
Yeah.
They're not goal-orientated.
No, exactly. Mutations happen, and you're right. Sometimes they're great. Sometimes they mean that you only have half a hand.
Yeah.
But they might also mean that you have extra large muscles. So, now you have a long neck. You can reach the higher leaves, and you can, because you can get this higher food than all of your other shorter neck counterparts, you can survive to reproduce with another individual who also has a slightly longer neck, and the two of you will have offspring. And chances are, or there is a chance, that this offspring will have carried on your slightly longer neck gene, and from birth they'll be at an advantage. And that carries on for a few generations, or thousands and millions of generations, and suddenly you've got a giraffe. There's probably a few more steps involved than that, but essentially this is how physical traits are created in any organism, is by thousands, millions, billions worth of generations of mutations and breeding. So this is how natural selection works. Basically, it's the same with all living organisms. And it happens naturally, so bacteria naturally become resistant to antibiotics because the ones that are resistant can reproduce and they pass on the resistant genes to their offspring or to themselves in the case of asexual reproduction.
Yeah.
Grass can become better able to deal with drought. Apes can get better able to fight with one another. Fish sense of smell can get better to better find food. If you have even a slight genetic advantage, you are likely to survive to reproduction age and pass on your favourable genes to your offspring, who will then pass it on to their offspring, and so on and so forth. And each generation, the genes get slightly better at dealing with the ever-changing environment or increasingly deadly predators or evasive prey. Well, that's kind of how genes and natural selection and selective pressures work.
Uh-huh.
Which is kind of the base level to genetically modified organisms. Okay, so humans have been controlling this process for literally thousands of years. We take advantage of this generational change that we can make to organisms through selective breeding. So
dogs.
What?
Did I get the right segue this time? It's not much of a segue. I just coughed and said dogs. So
dogs. It's actually not the example that I was going to make, but you're very right.
Damn it.
So dogs were once wolves. All dogs. And believe it or not, that little Chihuahua and that big Great Dane, they are the same species. But because of selective breeding, we have bred into these dogs certain phenotypes that we want them to look like. But the example that I was going to use, I was going to say, imagine that you're a Mayan farmer and you're farming a berry crop, and you notice that there's a few of your berry bushes that have a much higher yield than the rest of the bushes. Or you're farming some corn or maize and you notice that some of the corn cobs are much bigger and juicier than the rest. Or you're farming tomatoes and you notice that a few of your plants aren't being eaten by bugs quite as much as the other plants. Well, you would take the seeds from these individuals with the desirable traits, and that'd be the basis for your next crop. Or you could cross-pollinate the two individuals and get the best genetics, and you'd get some sort of super seed. And the next crop, the next year would be slightly better. And you can do that for 10 years and your crop's going to be looking mighty fine. And this is the basis of selective breeding.
This is so interesting, selective breeding and artificial selection, because it's a pre-scientific idea. And it's a pre-theory of evolution idea.
Yeah.
And it was just generally accepted that you could breed certain characteristics into certain organisms, and nobody understood the mechanism until Darwin came along.
Exactly. But I suppose we didn't need to know how it worked. We just were very, very practical creatures. And we knew that it did work, so let's just keep doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And the way we found, just to jump back to my topic, the way we found out the mechanism was using the scientific method. Hooray!
Exactly. Yay! A very logical link between the two of us.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the basis of selective breeding. And we do the same thing with animals. There aren't herds of wild dairy cows roaming around in the world. The dairy cow was probably created by selectively breeding a buffalo or something similar. And as you mentioned, dogs, there weren't packs of wild chihuahuas or corgis roaming around. As cool as
No, because there's no way they would ever survive in the wild.
Oh, yeah, some dog breeds could, but it's ridiculous to think.
Yeah, some could, but
they are wild, they were ever wild animals. They were all wolves, and they were, I think mentioned it a couple of episodes ago about specifically breeding the wolves that killed you the least. And then you ended up with a dog that you could almost be a pet. So this is where it started from. But I could go on all day about these examples. I saw a photo today of what corn would have looked like before humans started to selectively breed it. And it actually looked just like the seed head of a grass that was in seed. But that's essentially what it is. Corn is a grass. And we probably would have started with a grass that naturally had a big seed head that people chewed on and realised was kind of tasty. And then we planted crops out of it. And the grass that produced a slightly bigger seed head, we kept that seed for next year and then planted crops of that and so on and so forth. And now we get these big juicy ears of corn that we throw on the barbecue and is excellent.
So I see your point here is that we have been genetically modifying organisms for thousands of years.
Yeah.
But if I can anticipate what you're about to say, the issue that people have in a modern context is not with the artificial selection side of genetic modification. It's with the manipulation in a laboratory of the genetic information of current species.
You know what? If I didn't know that you were 1,000 kilometres away sitting in a house somewhere in New South Wales, I could have sworn at that moment that you were standing behind me reading my notes because that's exactly what I was about to say.
Yes! It's almost like I know you well and we've talked about this sort of stuff for a long time.
Yeah, I suppose. So you're right. All of these examples have involved the same species and just selective breeding. But what if you could take a desirable trait out of one species and implant it into another species? And this is where I introduce you to BT crops. And this is what they're commonly called because BT stands for Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a type of bacteria and it's difficult to say, so let's just call it BT crops.
I love it when you try and pronounce species names. It's the funniest thing.
Bacillus thuringiensis. All right, use this. Bacillus thuringiensis.
Okay.
So Bacillus thuringiensis is a naturally occurring bacteria. It is pretty good. That produces a protein that's toxic to many of the insect pests that cause a problem for the agricultural industry. So BT crops are crops that are genetically engineered to produce this same toxin as the bacteria BT. It produces the same toxin
Toxin?
in every cell of the plant.
Toxin sounds like a bad word.
Well, it is. It is very, very bad news if you're an insect because what it means is that this bacteria destroys the gut of these insects. And so if you genetically engineer the crop to produce the same protein, then if any of these insects eat any part of the plant, they will die. And this is an amazing breakthrough, which means that you didn't need to spend time or money spraying your crop with insecticides, which eventually leads to a higher yield and lower cost in labour and lower cost in insecticide use and so on and so forth. It's a great thing for farmers and food production worldwide.
It's got toxins in it, and next you're going to tell me that human digestive systems are physiologically different to insect digestive systems.
Oh, well, they are, exactly. So this protein works on a certain pathway that only exists in insects. It doesn't exist in humans.
A certain physiological pathway you're talking about.
Oh, yes. Yeah, no, I'm not talking about like the yellow brick road.
Yeah.
That's a totally different pathway that we don't want to go down this episode. Yeah, so what will kill a grasshopper, we can eat, and there will be literally no side effects for a human. So, I talked about in the glyphosate episode that Monsanto is a herbicide company. They designed Roundup, and they then produced genetically modified seed for corn and soybeans and some other crops that we could spray Roundup directly onto to control weeds but not kill the crop. So these crops are called Roundup Ready crops, which is also a fantastic breakthrough, and it meant that you could spray glyphosate, which is an incredibly effective herbicide, over your crop, directly over your crop, and the crop would survive and there'd be no weeds underneath it. Perfect. I wish I could do that in my garden, but none of the seeds that I use are Roundup Ready.
Of course you'd say that, you Monsanto shill.
Yeah, I've sold out, man.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you, though?
This episode's sponsored by Monsanto. Not really.
Kind of wish it was. Imagine the kind of money that they have, though.
Oh, I don't know. Not so much anymore.
Nah, that's still good.
I want to make it abundantly clear that we are not sponsored by Monsanto.
Yeah, well, we shouldn't need to say that, but yeah, we're not sponsored by anybody. But maybe this is a good opening that if you would like to sponsor Idiofacto, please contact us on any of our social platforms at Idiofacto. Anyway, so there are thousands of examples of GMOs, but most of them are either designed to be resistant to a harsh environmental factor like salinity or drought, frosts, or pests, or they're designed to be resistant to a herbicide so that we can easily control weeds without risking crop death. So there's a few ways in which we can engineer new genes into an organism. And one of them is with a gene gun. And this is pretty cool. You literally get the gene that you want to insert. So the gene could be, let's call it salinity resistant from a salt bush. And you take that particular gene and you coat it in gold, or you cover a gold particle in this particular gene. And then you put cells from the organism that you'd like that gene in. Let's say it's a wheat crop. You take wheat cells, put them into a vacuum container, and then using pressurized gas, you shoot these gold particles that are covered in the salt-resistant gene, and you shoot them at the cells, and it's just a bit haphazard, but hopefully some of the genes will make it into the nucleus of the wheat, and you'll end up with wheat that's got this salinity resistance in its genome. So that's one way. And again, oh no, hang on. Can you put this on the list? The gene gun might be another episode. So another method that we can get new genes into an organism is by selective breeding. We've talked about this. Another one is irradiated mutagenesis, which is really cool. It's actually just, as it sounds, is applying radiation to a particular organism and hoping that the radiation causes a mutation that is favourable, that we are looking for. So I know that you said before that mutation doesn't have a goal in mind, but when we apply irradiated mutagenesis to an organism, we do have a goal in mind. And
yes,
this radiation can cause mutations that are favourable. Another pretty common way is with viral or bacterial vectors. So this is basically just designing viruses that are designed to insert certain genes into a host cell. All of these are very complicated, but for the purposes of this episode, you just need to know that it is possible to insert genes from one organism into another. So as I've said, this can lead to higher yields per farmed area, which makes better use of the space we've already got rather than clearing more land to grow more mediocre crops.
And also, we have an unsustainably increasing worldwide population.
Exactly. 9 billion people by 2050 is the prediction, which is insane.
So we're going to need a way to feed all of those people. In fact, we don't have a way currently to feed all of those people. So the more people that we have to feed, the better we're going to have to be at using the land that we do have to feed those people.
Exactly. So GMOs can also lead to resistance to harsh environments like pests, salinity, frost. We can grow crops in areas that would have traditionally killed the crop. And into the future, we can actually genetically modify food crops to contain higher levels of nutrients that many people might be deficient in. Or we could genetically engineer trees that are much more capable of taking in carbon dioxide and producing oxygen. Or we could genetically engineer microinvertebrates that can eat and break down microplastics in our waterways. Our imagination is really literally the limit. And it all sounds amazing, but is it all good? Well, yes, it is all good, is my answer, but not everyone thinks so. And of course, there are heaps of arguments against GM crops.
Yeah.
And basically all of them can be found in this documentary that I found called, wait for it, Seeds of Death.
Wow.
So the full name is Seeds of Death, Unveiling the Lies of GMOs. And it's this YouTube documentary.
Seeds of Death?
Oh, Seeds of Death, yeah.
So presumably they're not talking about artificially selected genetically modified organisms. They're talking about genetic engineering.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
It's just like, it's hard to know where to draw the line sometimes.
Exactly, yeah, you're totally right. And anyway, let's get into it. So it's this YouTube documentary by this guy called Gary Null. Oh, this guy. This guy is an AIDS denier.
Oh, wow.
I did a little bit of reading on it, but this episode's not on AIDS denial, but basically it's the belief that
AIDS denier.
That AIDS doesn't come from HIV, but it comes from other factors.
Wow, I did not think that was an actual thing. So that's going on the list as well.
Yeah, put AIDS denial on the list.
Man, we've increased the list by quite a few topics this
Got a few good topics, yeah. So anyway, this guy's an AIDS denier, and he's a conspiracy theorist extraordinaire. He claims to have
obviously, if he's an AIDS denier, you've got to be a conspiracy theorist, surely.
Oh, yeah. He claims to have a PhD in interdisciplinary studies.
What is that?
Which I hadn't heard of before, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not real, but I don't know what interdisciplinary studies is.
That's like saying I have a PhD in lots of things.
Well, the name of his thesis was a study of psychological and physiological effects of caffeine on human health.
Okay. That doesn't sound ridiculous.
No, it doesn't. Well, he got this PhD through the Union Institute and University, and they offer doctorate degrees specialising in education, leadership, humanities, and public policy.
Right.
Anyway, I still don't really know what interdisciplinary studies is. But anyway, this movie features many other well-known advocates of alternative and integrated medicine, like this guy Joseph Mercola, who has a PhD in osteopathy, and I'm pretty sure osteopathy is on the list.
Already on the list, yep.
Yep. And this other guy, Mike Adams, who calls himself a holistic nutritionist, who runs these websites wakingnews.com and naturalnews.com.
Hey, guess what else is on the list?
Well,
nutritionists.
Nutritionists, excellent. So this guy, Mike Adams, is also an AIDS denialist and a conspiracy theorist and an anti-vaxxer.
Okay, well, if I'm going to be generous and acknowledge our own biases here, their qualifications don't necessarily invalidate their lack of scientific qualifications doesn't necessarily invalidate their arguments.
No, it doesn't. But I'm just pointing out patterns. I'm basically just drawing your attention to the kind of people that we're dealing with.
Yep. Yeah. Fair enough. Yep. And what are their arguments?
Well, yeah. There's this documentary that they've made, Seeds of Death, that condemns Monsanto and all GMOs. And basically the arguments against GMOs in this film are the arguments against GMOs that you'd see anywhere. So it's a really good place to refute all of the commonly heard arguments, all in the one place. It's very convenient. So while it might seem like I'm just picking on this doco, I am, but I'm also picking on all of the anti-GMO arguments equally. And they just all happen to be in this doco in one nice sort of kooky, crazy little package.
Yep. So
a lot of these counter-arguments I got from this website called RationalWiki.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever been onto RationalWiki?
Yeah, RationalWiki is great.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it, you should check it out. They're fairly biased to their point of view.
Terribly biased.
And they're really snarky and patronising and deliberately facetious. But I kind of like it. And
it is funny. I mean, I wouldn't do research using only RationalWiki, but it's quite good to get humorous examples of logical fallacies and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And they actually still link all of their arguments to peer-reviewed journal articles. And most of these counter-arguments that I am about to reference, I went and checked out the peer-reviewed journal article, and yeah, they all sort of seem to hold up. So anyway, it's an interesting site to go onto anyway, to at least start your research. So I'll begin some of the anti-GMO points now. So one of them... the only reason chemical companies are producing GMO herbicide-resistant crops is to sell more herbicide. Well, this is actually kind of partly true, but you've got to remember that they are a business, first and foremost, and the products that they produce have to be good enough so that people will buy them.
Yes.
These products actually do work, and they do work well, and they're tried and tested, and they are purchased by farmers and agriculturalists, and they wouldn't buy them if they didn't work.
I don't really understand how that is an argument. Of course they're making... that's the whole point of their business model.
Exactly. Obviously they produce a product to sell, but, is this such a bad thing? It's like the common argument that's used against pharmaceutical companies. They want you to be sick so that they can sell the product and the like. But anyway, that's probably a discussion for another day.
I think the problem that people have with it is that it sounds like when you make that argument that they're artificially creating a demand for a product. And that's not the case. There's demand for pesticides, herbicides, regardless of whether there's herbicide-resistant crops.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're right. This is an observable problem that needs an answer, and these guys have come up with an answer to it. And because of their work in coming up with an answer to it, they want to get paid for their work, obviously. And don't we all? So anyway, that's that one. The next one. They told us that Agent Orange was safe, so we shouldn't trust them on GMOs. So
that's a red herring.
Yeah, so we could just about plain name this logical fallacy.
Yeah.
But it's actually also untrue. Monsanto and other
really?
Yeah, Monsanto and other companies that made Agent Orange, like Dow, were given the formula by the US government, and they actually warned the government before the use that it had dioxin in it. That's this incredibly dangerous chemical, and they said, use it, it'll work really well, it'll kill the plants, but it's got dioxin in it, and it probably won't be great for humans. So, even this aside, can we judge the credibility of a company's work based on their past endeavours? For example, Volkswagen was founded by the Nazis. Nissan made engines and vehicles for the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. Nintendo made playing cards for Japanese soldiers and war criminals. You know what I mean? Like, the behaviour in the past has almost nothing to do with the products that they create today, in today's society, and shouldn't be used as an argument to tear down the validity of their claims and products.
Yes. I mean, yeah, there is an argument to say that that's what we've done by attacking the credibility of the creators of this documentary based on their qualifications.
Yeah, you're right. But if the creators of this documentary had made a documentary and had interviewed scientists that didn't necessarily have an agenda, or had produced work that was testable and proven to be backed up by peer-reviewed journal articles,
and unbiased,
then it wouldn't matter about their credentials. And the credentials wasn't the reason that this documentary is wrong. No,
it's just indicative of their attitudes, their credulity and their willingness to believe pseudosciences. So I see your point, but I mean, there's a balance between saying that, they're saying that Monsanto can't be trusted as an organization because of their past behavior, and it doesn't matter what's happened in the past because this is not the past. There's a balance between those two arguments, and I don't think that you're right. The source of the product or the information does not necessarily mean the arguments that are presented are wrong. But
no, I know what you're trying to. Yeah, I know what you're getting at. I think for the point of this particular argument, the fact is that just because Monsanto made Agent Orange doesn't necessarily mean that all products that they're making now are as deadly as Agent Orange.
That's exactly right. You have to take into account the conflicts of interest. Obviously, they want to sell their products, so they want to assure everyone that it is perfectly safe, because if they said that it was very bad, then people wouldn't buy it. But then there's the balance of, that's illegal to claim that something is safe when it's not. And there's also peer-reviewed research that says that it's okay. I assume there's peer-reviewed research that is not directly funded by Monsanto that agrees that genetically modified organisms are safe.
Exactly. There's heaps. Yeah.
Yeah. So Monsanto isn't the only corporation or the only organization that's saying that these things are safe. If they were, then you would go, well, yes, you would. You've got a conflict of interest here to say that it is perfectly safe, but they're not the only people who are saying that.
Oh, exactly. And if they were found to have lied back in the 50s when they told us that Agent Orange was safe, and then they were also found to have lied when they told us that glyphosate and GMOs were safe, and they were proved wrong by scientists through peer-reviewed
independent scientists.
Yeah, exactly. Then
there might be a case to answer.
The reputation, would hold up as that they are liars and we shouldn't trust them about GMOs. But this is not the case. And the next point is basically they've taken agriculture and built an industrial model which doesn't fit nature. So this is the appeal to nature argument, but basically what is natural? Where do you draw the line? Like, farming certainly isn't natural.
No, absolutely
Cars
not.
aren't natural. Toilets aren't natural. Civilized humans, as we live today, really aren't natural. And if you want to take it that far, what that humans do today is natural. Why are we singling out GMO crops as not being natural.
Yep. If you want a bit more information about what is natural, and I think I got a lot of perspective about humans and nature from reading Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. I'll put a link to that book in the show notes. I would really encourage people to check that out. It gives you a lot of perspective on the nature of humans and what is considered natural and things like that. So,
awesome. Well, the next point is Monsanto's own research shows that rats who were fed this BT corn, that they had signs of toxicity in the liver and kidneys.
Okay.
So, the counter-argument to that, the guy that made this claim, Gillies Eric Seralini, he did this study and he published 2 other studies. And both of these studies were trashed, absolutely thrown out by the European Food Safety Authority for being excellent examples of poor statistical analysis.
Right.
Among other issues. Monsanto also published a somewhat easier to read summary of the issues with their 2009 study, and I know this, we might say this is biased, but keep in mind that Seralini, this other guy, was funded by both the organic industry and other lobby groups, and Monsanto's document contains responses from many other sources that aren't directly linked or funded by Monsanto.
Right.
So this is what we were saying by needing non-biased third-party researchers.
Yep.
The next one, peer-reviewed studies show that there's an association between heavy GMO consumption and serious health problems, including asthma and food allergies. Well, this one comes directly from Jeffrey Smith's website. Jeffrey Smith is another guy that's in the documentary. He runs the Institute for Responsible Technology. So he claims that, on his website, he claims that soon after GM soy was introduced to the UK, soy allergies skyrocketed by 50%. Perhaps the US epidemic of food allergies and asthma is a causality of genetic manipulation. So, it seems here that Smith has fallen victim to the
correlation does not imply causation.
Causation assumption, yeah, exactly. And this is an issue that appears over and over and over again throughout the course of this movie.
I mean, it's not an awful theory. Like, at least they are connected things. That those, like, if that correlation is a thing, then it is worth investigating. But just because there is a correlation does not mean there's causation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but I think that was the assumption in this case.
Well, it's just the argument. Yeah, if you use that as your argument, then that's very poor logic. All that to say, it raises questions, but as I said again earlier in the episode, that's the second step of the scientific method, is making an observation and asking questions. You then have to go on to develop a testable hypothesis and actually test that hypothesis and then iterate. So, yes, it raises questions, but as far as we know, there's been no further study that confirms any causation or that even suggests any causation.
Yeah, exactly. And we've covered spurious correlations before. Yeah. Just because something has a very, very tight correlation doesn't necessarily... I mean, it could, and it's a good way to understand trends, but it doesn't. It's not always the case. And just observing this trend or this correlation does not necessarily mean that the work's been done to prove that it's causing these allergies. And in fact... It
certainly can't be used as evidence to say that GM crops should be banned.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's not enough evidence to say that there's not enough evidence to say that GM crops are causing these allergies. Put it that way.
That's right. There's actually really no evidence. There's just a correlation.
Oh, yeah. A potential correlation.
Yeah.
We can't even find the information.
We couldn't find the link to.
Yeah.
Okay, the next point. The most comprehensive analysis of GMOs shows that they actually reduce yield. And another point that's also kind of linked.
What?
Sustainable technologies can increase yield by an average of 79%. Now, as RationalWiki pointed out, both of these are downright lies.
Yeah, I struggle to see how that's the case.
And without even looking at any of the links to these claims, it's just true. So many claims in this movie are totally fabricated. If GM crops don't increase yields, why are we using them? Why does almost every farmer around the world use these genetically modified crops because they do increase yields.
Well, it's in every farmer's best interest to increase their yield. So if there's a way to increase their yield that they're not using, then what I don't understand, is it just marketing they're saying that is?
I have no idea what this point even means. And you're right, you touched on a good point that humans, and especially those running a business, will inherently actively seek out and adopt the best methods to make us the most amount of money and the easiest methods. So yeah, these are both lies. GMOs don't reduce yield, and they actually are probably the best way to increase your yield. I mean, there are some other sustainable technologies I can understand that might increase the yield. I mean, this claim of 79%, that seems huge. But for example, if you paid 10,000 people to walk through your crops and give each plant the measured amount of nutrients and water and hand weed the crop, that probably could increase your yield.
Absolutely would increase your yield. It would also decrease your profit.
Exactly.
In fact, you probably not make a profit, which is why you don't do that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, I spent a lot of time trolling this RationalWiki and looking at the various links to counter arguments from this rubbish documentary, and I really could go on forever here. And there's so many claims in this movie that frustrate me so much watching it, just making claims from an entirely unscientific point of view. And they're really easily refutable if you actually use really good scientific method and scientific sources. But they didn't. They very rarely listed their sources. And when they did, they were either incredibly biased or not credible at all.
I mean, we tried hard to find some evidence and couldn't. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're sort of hidden. And it's such a shame that GMOs have such a bad name because they're so useful. And we really are going to need them as the Earth ramps up to support 9 billion people by 2050. At the end of the day, no GMO crop is designed and released for sale without extensive testing. And it's just what's required and expected as a very bare minimum. But if we do find that there's something wrong with a certain strain of GM crop, we can stop using it and use science to modify it so that it'll be safe again before we use it. And this is the beauty of science, that it's adaptable based on new findings, almost by definition.
That's it for this episode of Idiofacto. Forward all suggestions, hate mail, evidence and arguments to idiofacto@gmail.com.
And you can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and all the other social platforms at Idiofacto. The links are in the show notes. So there's a few ways in which we can engineer new genes into an orgasm. Oh,
wow.
I mean, I was going to say that at some stage.
Normally has genes in it. So that's kind of the entire point. But
oh God, I knew I was going to say that. I knew the amount of times that I was going to say organism this episode. One of those was going to be an orgasm, and there it is. Let me say that sentence again.
Well, there's the blooper.
Oh no.